In the last lecture, we used our recipe service, and we created it in the first place, we filled it with some life, to manage our recipes in a central place. That is working great. Now let's use that service to improve our app. Remember, we have this long chain of inputs and outputs, getting a selected item from the recipe item component over the recipe list component to the recipes component, here where we listen to that event, and then all the way down using the selected recipe property to the recipe detail component. So this cross-component communication. That is a super long way for just informing another component that we selected an item. We can do better, and we should. So what my goal is, that in the recipe item component, where we have this on selected click, that here we can directly inform the recipe detail component. So in on click, what I actually want to do here is, I want to not emit an event here. I will get rid of it here, and therefore I can remove the imports from of output and event emitter. Instead here, I want to call some method in my service, which will then, transfer this data for me. So in the recipe service, I'll add a new property, a public property, which I'll name recipe selected. Of course, you could choose a different name. It will be an object instantiated by using event emitter from Angular core. So you need to add this import. Let's put it at the top of the file. That's kind of a good practice to do with your Angular imports. It will hold some recipe data, and that's all I want to do in the recipe service. With this setup, and of course you could also encapsulate this by providing a method to get access to it and one to emit the event, but I will use the property itself. So by adding this, I can now go back to my recipe item component, and in onSelected, I want to do something with that property in the recipe service. So first of all, let's inject it. Let's inject the recipe service as you learn to do it. Make sure to import it, pointing to the recipe service file in the right folder. And then on the recipe service, we can use this recipe selected event emitter and call emit and emit the recipe of this recipe item component, because that is the one we selected. And that's the data we want to pass. Now with this trick, or with this approach, we can go to the recipe list component and remove this listener where we listened to whether we did select it or not. We can get rid of the on recipe selected code and get rid of our own emitted event here. So we're already saving a lot of code. Get rid of all these imports which we don't need anymore. And in the recipes component HTML file, we can also get rid of this event here on the recipe list, because we no longer use this chain of data to pass it around. And now all I want to do is, in this component here, I want to listen to this event in the recipe service, so that I can now correctly decide whether we do have a selected recipe and should therefore render the detail component, or if we should still show this template with this please select a recipe text. Therefore, I will inject the service here too, recipe service, and since I provide the recipe service on this component and all the other components in this recipe folder use the same instance of the service, which of course is super important. Otherwise, the service where I emit the event would be a different one to the one I listen to it, so I would never get informed about the event. But here it will work because we're using the same instance. So here in ng on init, for example, I can set up my listener. So on the recipe selected, I can subscribe to it and get informed about any changes. And now here, I know I will receive some data which is of type recipe, because that's how we configured the event emitter. It will give us a recipe. And in this ES6 arrow function here, that is the argument list, and here is the function body. Here, I simply want to set this selected recipe equal to the recipe we got with the event. And with that, we should get the same behavior as before if we reload the app. But now, having a much leaner approach of using a service for cross-component communication, which of course makes it much easier to pass this data as you saw, and we don't have to build this complex chain of event and property binding.